the whole point. So that localization of these outcomes and metrics is super critical, and that's a role that I think we can play with helping connect the dots to the local level, the players who know those landscapes super well, and then hopefully pull the whole system together, the capital markets and the policies to support the right things in the right places.
I think also that does a good job of tying the macro and the micro together. You have on a field the problem of measuring soil carbon, and then the more and more you zoom out. I mean, Brazil is a country that has quite an amazing foundation for scaling regenerative agriculture, I think, or we think, with lots of policies that channel money to farmers, lots of policies that channel demand for buying products from farmers, but they are disjointed in that they don't aim for the same things. And so if we could agree on the outcomes that not only businesses should be orientating themselves around, but the policy should be orientating itself around, we might start to pull some of those threads together. But Anna, let's go back to the kind of balance sheet idea. We've heard from a brand that putting money into regenerative agriculture pays, but it would be nice if it was accounted for differently. You work for EY, you work for a big accounting house. What do you guys see as things we can do now under existing accounting codes to help the value of such projects get realized more? And where does the system actually just get stuck? And where do we need a bit more of a fundamental shift? It's a big question.
Well, great question for sure. So good morning. Thank you for the invitation, Felipe. I'm really glad to be here. When it comes to accounting, our view is that accounting works with the past. So backward looking is what dominates how we do accounting, how we know how to do accounting. But what we are talking here is a new kind of business. So Rob just told us that we have to shift business as usual for a new kind of agriculture. So we are talking about regenerative agriculture, but our farmers do not understand it. That's the same way accounting goes. When we talk about it, we need to include new metrics. So we don't have the metrics yet, and we need to educate accountants to also look forward. So we need now new bases to do that. But how to do that if we don't have the metrics? So we go back, no metrics, no data. The starting point would be really to build the metrics. So how we build the metrics and why we would be building the metrics? Because we need transparency, we need comparability, we need trustfulness on the data. This is all under construction. We are here discussing it, but we cannot take more 20 years in order to reach the outcome that we need, to have the metrics and then to be able to discuss how to account it. We have to do it right now. How do we put it within the governance framework? How do we make it happen for the accountants, for our balance sheet, for the bottom line? It's an education process, but as long as we are talking about something that is voluntary, it will take longer because we have economic actors. We are discussing with economic actors, such as the farmers. Our shareholders need to receive the financial results. If they don't have it, we will not be able to conclude the metrics and not even go for the accounting. So, of course, this is a great challenge, but we have to keep moving on. If we think about policy framework in order to educate how the farmers would be doing it and how the accountability could look at it and how we will be constructing the metrics, we need a link between what Brazil is doing right now for the biodiversity strategy that was published, the bioeconomy strategy that was published, our targets that we need to present here within the global biodiversity framework, they are not connected at all. So a step back, if we don't resolve this, we won't have the data to be accountable for, and we won't be able to see the impacts on the bottom line, the positive impacts on the bottom line. That's just to start with. But then we also have to think about foreign trade and how our farmers are behaving in face of the new regulations. So when it comes to the EUDR, the free deforestation rule, when it comes to the CSDDD, how are we expecting to fulfill these rules in order to ensure that we'll keep on exporting our goods here to the EU at least if we don't have the metrics? And if we are not accounting for how much water we need and how we should be valuing this water in order to export soy. These are challenges, these are different paths to be taken, but we need to do that right now. So we now are thinking of how to include this forward-looking within the metrics that are under construction to talk to the agriculture business in Brazil. But again, we need first a bit of education to show that they will have positive economic impacts on that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, for an accountant to look at an investment and say, yes, this is an asset, it needs to be into something that gives you value over the long term. And so ultimately, your question on the metrics is, what are the metrics that we can all describe as being valuable for what different reason? And some of them are a metric that describes a reduction in risk over time. Some of them are metrics that describe meeting a compliance standard and maintaining access to market. So there's all these reasons that are floating around, and they need to land into a bit of a structure. Felipe, I think that's a good point to bring in the land banking group story. I mean, we've heard we need metrics, we need tech, we need MRV, we need a way to invest. So tell us a little bit about our story, how the land banking group tries to tie a few of these threads together in the context of Brazil.
No? Yeah, perfect. Okay, thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everyone, for joining. It's great to be between some friends here and the partners as well. So thanks for joining this early morning. So yeah, indeed, it's great to be, one of the works that we are doing in the land banking group is basically on a high level trying to build an economy that is indexed on nature. So how can we, make sure that we can value the natural capital that is being built by land stewards in a way that we can make sure that they can be rewarded for those natural capital. So basically, we build like a digital nature market infrastructure called Landler, where we're connecting land stewards, farmers, communities who are the originators of natural capital with those who wants to invest in natural capital, from three different angles of investors. One is the value chain organizations such as Nestlé and others who depend on nature, depend on natural capital, but then also beyond value chain organizations that is looking to invest in nature for their strategy purposes. But then last but not least, also like financial institutions who also holds assets and that wants to kind of make sure that they can invest within the natural capital within their portfolio of investments. So basically, we created like a contract, a legal contract that can facilitate these transactions of natural capital to flow capital to those who steward nature and those who wants to invest that depends on it. Because we see today that, in Brazil, investing in nature, so that we don't see so that we can really see the transformational change that nature can develop, can deliver return on investments for companies that is actually putting all their efforts to build resilience. Because, we see today, for example, 50% of our global GDP, it depends on natural capital. And I can challenge that it's much more than that. But, so like if you create like an engine that you can facilitate contracts to make natural capital investments flow to those who steward nature, it allows them to improve the climate resilience, de-risk the business of everyone in the supply chain, and make sure that we can have a much more balanced economy for our future, so that we can build an economy that's indexed on nature. But there are a series of challenges there. One is like, for example, when you put nature on the balance sheet, there's still very low, public incentives from a policy perspective. So CFOs and accountants, they're still lacking knowledge and awareness about this topic. So it's a lot of like investment to showcase the real case scenarios where nature is actually adding financial value for CFOs and companies that is investing in nature. So that's something we're trying to solve and work together with a few partners, including some of them here, to make sure that in Brazil, as a powerhouse of natural capital, we can make sure that we can build a nature-positive economy.
Thank you, Felipe. John, you were late, so we've made you wait to the end until we talk to you. But you've heard lots of different perspectives on agriculture in Brazil. As the Rockefeller Foundation, you have almost a fun problem, which is where do we dive in and help this massive suite of problems with some money and with some resource? So tell us a little bit about what lens you as a foundation, look at these problems through, and where do you see actually the big breakthroughs needing to occur in the context of Brazil?
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, I think that frames it really well. I mean, when we think about these problems, we're thinking about them systemically, and where are kind of the soft spots where catalytic capital can actually make a difference. And I think there are a few places, especially, and I think many of them were mentioned here. One of them, of course, is around definitions and metrics. And we think that for quite some time, even the term regenerative agriculture is tossed around without grounding in an actual truth of what that means, and it gets confounded with agroecology and traditional ecological knowledge and other terms. So one of those efforts is through something called Regen 10, which we've worked on for a couple of years now, to develop outcomes-based metrics, so that we're really looking at the outcomes. Considering that agriculture is so localized and crop-specific, we need to look at outcomes. And you can look up Regen 10 and see the whole kind of work that's been done there, but with many experts around the world, including indigenous and frontline communities, which brings me to the second point. So I think another place that we stand to hopefully bend the arc a bit is the centering of indigenous and frontline communities in these conversations. Too often, I think the capitalist colonial mindset has dominated the conversation without the inclusion and the explicit exclusion of many of these people and communities. And they often stand to suffer the most from changes that occur, including climate change and loss of biodiversity. And often we talk about biodiversity, but don't talk about the stewards of biodiversity. And I think that that's really what we hope to do through our grant making, is to elevate those voices and give them a platform to have parity, at least on some level, with corporations and other actors in the space. Another space that we've been working in is around nutrition. So there's been a lot of talk about regeneratively produced foods or organic foods being healthier for people. And there's been, spotty evidence here or there that maybe the nutrition is different. But I think the scientific community has not reached a full consensus on is regenerative agriculture better for humans at the nutritional level? Perhaps, it's better for people on the environmental level impacts. But can we show definitively? So we have a project called the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, which is an effort to develop comprehensive, standardized food composition analyses, including looking at indigenous foods. We have 9 centers of excellence, 7 of which are in the global south, and they're actively analyzing foods that are more biodiverse than the 8 to 12 staple crops that most people eat around the world, and include this vast diversity of more underutilized crops, they're often called, right? So we want to help bend the arc there, right? Show that the nutritional impacts of regenerative agriculture could perhaps bring some premium to that as well. And then finally, I think our biggest play that we're about to embark on, and we've done some work in the past as well, is around a market move about driving demand for regenerative food through institutional procurement. So we think there's a tremendous potential, particularly around school meals, to drive demand for regenerative food. If governments can be convinced that perhaps through a true cost accounting metric or other metrics, that purchasing regeneratively grown food is better for people and planet, it's better for their communities, it's better for their country, and also they recognize the need for feeding children through school meals, there's a convergence there that could drive demand and provide a secure market for farmers that are growing regeneratively or farmers that need to transition to grow regeneratively. So we're doing work in Brazil, to stand up work in Brazil and East Africa and a couple other geographies as kind of lighthouse examples of how and why you might stand up institutional procurement, particularly school meals, as a demand driver for regenerative agriculture.
Just like to add one very quick point. Thanks, John, for walking through that. If you're hearing about some of this for the first time, you may have heard me say that we're working on metrics for Regen Ag, and John say that Rockefeller is working with Regen 10 on the same thing. I want to be super clear. I think we have a responsibility to harmonize, not add more stuff out in the world. And that's exactly what we've done. So Regen 10 is one of those key partners that I mentioned who've been part of our network to harmonize these Regen Ag outcomes and metrics. And I think my understanding is Regen 10 tends to focus more at the farm level our role working with corporates is to say, okay, how can a corporate roll those metrics up to be able to aggregate them at the global level and then report out according to the voluntary and required frameworks? So just wanted to sort of clarify that. And in fact, our downscaling work on metrics in Brazil is funded by a Rockefeller grant coming up. So we're really excited to continue to join those dots more at the landscape level.
Can I just pick up on that? So I think this is a really important point, going back to what we said earlier on about complexity. I remember when the Regen 10 project was launched, in fact, it was on the very, very first call, and it occurred to me then that really what we were trying to do was do two things at once: move fast and move slow. We needed to move fast because I've already said, we've got a 2030 goal. We haven't got time to wait. We needed to get going, and there's a lot of things we know we can get on with. So that was the kind of the move fast agenda. But we did know, and we fully understand the Regen 10 approach, which is that you need to go out and talk to people. You need to go and speak with communities, speak with farmers, speak with IPLCs, and really understand what's working out there and what isn't. Now, where we're at in the process, last time I looked, it was quite a long outcome. And it now needs to be, there's two things need to happen now. One is that list needs to be shortened on the Regen 10 rubric. At the same time, we've also got to be looking at how to synthesize these models. Because if we do not, all we're doing is perpetuating the very problem that we said we needed to fix in the first place, which is remove complexity and make it easier for farmers.
Oh, yes. Well, I think a corporation would want it to be simplified, so I empathize. What I will say is that one way to conceptualize the idea of regenerative agriculture is from shallow to deep. And maybe you've heard this framing before. In the shallow end, you're really focused on soil health, and that may be all your metrics around soil health. And then you move a little bit deeper and you're thinking about biodiversity, you're thinking about issues around water, and then on the deepest end, you're thinking about people, culture, society, equity. And I would argue that actually those are the most important things. And those are complex. They need nuance to actually figure out how you measure those things and report them accurately. So I empathize with that, and I think we do need to find those ways to measure those things accurately. But it does get more complex the more you actually want to do the right thing and push the whole system towards that truly I mean, the other question is, what foods are you producing with these regeneratively grown plants or animals, right? If you're producing food that is killing people, if it's making people sick, is it regenerative? If it's causing diabetes and other diseases, right? I mean, I think that's something to discuss as well.
Could I just add one point? I would also include, Rob, especially on your speech, that we need companies to sit with the government also, and then have the government integrate the policies that we already have and the ones that we are building up. If not, all this work here could be lost because we will not have the right incentives from the government and we will not have the policy framework that we need for the Regen Ag to work in Brazil.
And that invites not only cynicism, but also backward steps. I mean, on the metrics, I think your framing of, we say regenerative agriculture. What is regenerative agriculture? It's not a binary decision where something is regenerative or it's not. It is a scale. And so whatever suite of metrics we align on has to account for that scale. But I guess it also has to account for the fact that in a country like Brazil, in different states, it means very, very different things because you're talking about different ecological conditions, different cropping systems, different social systems. And so again, there is nuance, and you almost need a system that has the flexibility to kind of change over time as we do the slow work of talking to people and figuring out what really does work. So it's a very, very nuanced conversation, but it is at the heart of it. And ultimately, if we don't find that level of clarity, then we can never build the solutions to do anything. I mean, companies like the Land Banking Group, we pick metrics to build MRV models for, but if we don't know which ones everybody needs, and then all the companies are fighting over which metrics, we just end up with more and more complexity and more mess. So the quicker we can align on this, the easier. And I think we will align on it by doing rather than by having lots of calls about tables of metrics, and it will be in the field where this stuff gets defined. We have, I guess, 5 more minutes left, and because you guys all got up so early to come and see us, we wanted to give you the chance to ask some questions. So, Helen, your hand went straight up.
Thank you. Great panel. Helen Crowley with Nature Matters. Love regenerative ag. And sorry I missed the first half an hour, so you might have already clarified this. But we're sitting in the Nature Positive Pavilion, and I'm really interested in your perceptions and understanding about how far can we push, what is the contribution that Regen Ag does towards our nature positive goals? Because at the moment we talk a lot about stopping the drivers of loss through Regen Ag and restoring soil biodiversity, so that's good. But how far do we go in setting an end state, an end goal in some of these farming and working landscapes? Because it's hard, and that's okay, but I think we have to start acknowledging that in certain regenerative agricultural landscapes, there's only so much restoration of wildlife, because there's a species component, not just an ecological integrity. So I just would love to hear a little bit of reflection on the role you see of Regen Ag in the sort of our nature positive agenda and ambition, and how far can we go with it?
Who wants to give that one a shot?
I can start, like, I don't mind, but Helen knows our work very well as well. But yeah, I mean, like, look, so Regen Ag, like when you move from convention to regenerative, you're basically improving the overall the health of the state of of the land. So like you're increasing soil health, you're increasing biodiversity, carbon storage, and so on. So basically, you are just like fundamentally building a long-term, system that you can rely on, and you can continuously like provide, the crops and the ecosystem services that our planet depends on. So basically, like when you talk about Regen Ag, like you directly see the nature positive outcomes when you move from conventional, like for example, what Belterra is doing in Brazil with converting degraded land of pasture land to agroforestry ecosystems. Like you see the richness of biodiversity come in. You see the soil being built and so on. So like this naturally is increasing the nature positive outcomes. However, if you don't measure, you cannot define what success is. So measuring the key nature outcomes, and that's something I judge a lot, because in Brazil, we see a lot of farmers claiming to be regenerative right now, and they're still far away from being truly regenerative. So measuring outcomes is key to prove that something can be actually nature positive, that's something that can be truly regenerative. And then how can we turn these outcomes into incentives, financial incentives, so they can improve even more the nature outcomes and become more nature positive. So this is kind of what we're trying to do, to make sure that we can measure outcomes and reward for those outcomes, so that we have a second income stream. So the farmer is not only paid for the crop, but also for nature outcomes. So nature positive for me means like building a long-term, like agricultural systems, Regen Ag system that is measuring outcomes and making sure that we can make better land use decisions to improve the nature positive. So that's kind of a bit of my contribution. But Helen knows, she's also an advisor, so there's a lot she knows about the work we do. So.
There's a longer answer to be given, which I won't, but I do want to make one point. I think it's really important to choose our words with care. And the fact that someone engages in low-till agriculture and a few cover crops, that's not regenerative. It's a regenerative agricultural practice, but there's a whole heap of practices that would ultimately lead to a situation where that form of agriculture is truly restorative, which is what we're talking about, right? I mean, that rather mouthful kind of regenerative agricultural practice, that's what we have to say, because it is a series of practices at this stage, not de facto regenerative.
And also here, not only the metrics, but then coming to the Rob speech again, we need to report it correctly. If we don't, Regen Ag won't have any roles within the Nature Positive Initiative. Reporting will be of the essence, and then we depend on the metrics and on the data, on the taxonomy, in order to report correctly, transparently, in a comparable way, and then to prove the results.
I think we are we at time? Okay, we have 5 minutes. Alice.
Thank you very much. Very insightful conversation. I have 2 quick questions, if we have the time. The first one is for Rob. The second one is for John. Rob, I loved your point around I have to frame it as a competitive advantage, even if it's a forward-looking competitive advantage. I'm very interested to hear what is the main argument that gives you the biggest push internally in a traditional corporate, right, that's focusing on shareholder value to drive this sort of effort that's arguably more complex, more uncertain, more fragmented? We talked a lot about metrics. What are the metrics? What are the main arguments that give you the biggest push internally? And the second question, John, you mentioned we have to drive demand for regenerative food. At the same time, we see the traditional dairy meat lobby being extremely strong, right? Arguing against Beyond Meat, for instance, the same ingredients in there as in like detergents or cleaning products. What can we do as a regenerative bubble that's here in Colombia to counter this traditional lobby? How can we lobby for regenerative agriculture?
As I learned years and years and years ago, is if you want to persuade people inside a business to adopt sustainable practices, you need to think very, very carefully about your language and how you communicate what it is you're trying to do. So a couple of reflections on what you said. I think the idea of avoided future cost is a really powerful one. And actually we can backcast now on a number of things that we've done over the years on forests, particularly, on plastics and packaging as another example. And we can point explicitly to investments that we made 10 years ago that are leading to massively avoided cost today. That's quite compelling when you start thinking about the future. Resilience in value chains is a really important concept. The idea of a strong, stable, resilient value chain in the future is compelling when you're talking to your procurement people. Competitive advantage is important when you're talking to marketing people. So it can vary depending on who you're speaking to. One other thought that occurred to me just over the last few days, we're coming up to the end of the year, so it's reporting season. So there's a lot of talk about our non-financial report, non-financial statement. I think we've got that language completely wrong. I think we should be talking about pre-financial statement, pre-financial report, because everything that's material that's in that report is going to be financial one day. So let's call it what it is.
And to your second question, I recall a year ago talking to a mentor of mine, an indigenous woman who we've worked with for a few years, and she's had great success in convincing corporations and countries to divest in dangerous mining operations, especially those mines that are being used to support the green economy. So, you know, all these people often don't think about where do these minerals come from that are going to give us electric cars, etc. And it can have a huge detrimental impact. And although it's a separate topic, she said, you know, when she's talking to corporations and lobbies, they often don't care about rights; they care about risks. So I think it might be similar. So I think appealing to risks is one way to to move the needle a little bit further. That there are real risks with continuing things the way that they are, and we're highlighting many of those being here today at COP16. So I think that would be my simple advice: is to focus on the risks.
Yeah. Sorry. I have
one very quickly then.
Sorry, one question. Sorry, my voice too much speaking yesterday. So maybe it's a question to Nestle. We have today government regulations like the US CSRD, ISSB. Then we have frameworks like Region 10. We have a regenerative certification system like the ROCs, Region Agri. We have the ESG. We have environmental crediting systems, market-based solutions like land banking. We have a DMRV systems that try to, you know, measure everything. How is a very non-harmonized, really complex scenario. So how are corporations like Nestle able to manage this whole complexity and this pressure from the market, and what are you actually doing, trying to not double the effort, and it's a big cost to manage the whole system. So how are you going to be able to deal with that in the future, and what is the process that, you know, Region 10, trying to harmonize everything under a much more simpler system?
It's a great question. One way we look at this is we go back to first principles. 20 years ago, more or less, Nestle came up with this theory of creating shared value. And it's ebbed and flowed over the years, the extent to which we talk about it inside the business. But the idea of creating shared value is a very simple one. We can't deliver for shareholders unless we're delivering for society as a whole. So in the midst of all of this complexity, our CEO and our chairman, really rather smart, they just go back to, yeah, hang on a minute, is this about creating shared value? And if it is, we're in. If it isn't, we'll comply. But we have to be very careful about taking on everybody's problems. So it's finding ways that at the heart of your value set, at the heart of what it is your company stands for, finding ways to just come back to first principles amidst all the noise.
We're going to have to close here as we are over time, but thank you all for joining us. And we took a few different routes in that conversation, and we covered quite a lot of ground. I think we described the problem very, very well, and I actually quite like where we finished, where I think the language that we must take around regenerative agriculture in the framing of a COP is that there is money on the table. It pays to be regenerative at farm level, in a value chain to society, and that is nature positive, but it pays, and there is money on the table, and that's much more of the critical language that at least I'll try and be using. So thank you all for joining us this morning. I think we'll be hanging around, so if we want to chat outside, then we can. But thank you for joining us.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start in a minute or so. If you take your seats, totally ignored. I didn't say any of that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to make a start. If you can take your seats. Guys, if you want to sit here.
Great, and we're gonna play a short video to start. Ooh, there we go. Just needed a woman's voice to calm everybody down. All right, Monique, are we cueing video? Perfect.
Based on the brilliance of biodiversity, nature-rich countries are blazing the bioeconomy trail, producing food, energy, and materials from renewable resources. By combining sustainable practices and traditional knowledge with cutting-edge innovations in technology, they are fast-tracking green growth, which creates new roles, reduces inequalities, and builds resilience for climate and nature. The bioeconomy holds the key to a just and sustainable transition. We just need to unlock it.
Great, thank you. So welcome everybody. My name is Julie McCarthy. I'm co-CEO at Nature Finance. This is, in case you want to check if you're in the right room, this is From Principles to Policies and Practice, the G20 initiative on the bioeconomy and how to mainstream its potential to scale. So I'd like to first note, if we could bring up that slide with the translation QR code for those who need translation. If you scan that code, you should be able to access it. And I would like to call up the panelists and introduce them. We have our moderator, my co-CEO, Simon Zodek from Nature Finance. Welcome. We have Dr. Ank Chabala, who's head of Indigenous Knowledge Valorization at the Department of Science and Innovation from the Government of South Africa. Welcome. You come up. We have a guest who has not yet made it through security yet, but will be joining us shortly, Braulio Diaz, who's Director of the Department for Conservation and Sustainable Use of Biodiversity from the Government of Brazil. We have Diane Holdorf, who's Vice President of Pathways at WBCSD. And we have Amadou Bamba Diop, who's Principal Environmental Specialist at the African Development Bank. Welcome, come on up. So we are thrilled to have such a distinguished panel here today to talk about the G20 initiative on the bioeconomy. We're going to talk about what's been accomplished so far. We're going to talk about where we see it headed and how to leverage the momentum that's been built over the past year to try and help shape an economy that works for nature, climate, and people. It's a shame that Braulio is not here because I want to say how exciting and inspiring it has been to witness Brazil's leadership in this area over the past year, from coming up with the idea for this bioeconomy initiative to developing and driving a really ambitious agenda to landing the high-level principles for the bioeconomy that were approved just in September of this year in Rio. The global initiative on bioeconomy is really the first time that nature has sort of taken main stage within G20 discussions around finance and economic transition and sustainable development. And the principles, and I really encourage you to look at them if you haven't gone through them yet, articulate a really clear, compelling, holistic vision for how the bioeconomy can drive just and green economic transition. They describe its central role in mitigation, adaptation, and resilience efforts. They identify its extraordinary potential for innovation and economic value added, new sources of jobs and livelihood opportunities. And also importantly, they lay out really clear guardrails and expectations around issues of equity and inclusion and participation, what high integrity governance of a sustainable bioeconomy looks like, to ensure that it's really helping advance development and green transition rather than undermine it. So we are thrilled that South Africa is now picking up the mantle of leadership with the Global Bioeconomy Initiative during its own G20 presidency. We're really excited to hear more today about their agenda and how to bring these principles to life in practice and really link it to a broader economic development agenda. We're also really thrilled to have a multilateral development bank representative and WBCSD here representing the sort of business and finance perspective, because these communities also obviously have a really critical role to play in bringing this agenda to life. So with that, I will pass over to our moderator, Simon Zadek.
My mic is on. Thank you very much. So let me add my welcome. I'm Simon Zadek. I'm the other co-CEO of Nature Finance. Really pleased to be here moderating the session. We're going to get into the panel quite quickly, but because the story of the bioeconomy is what on earth is it, we just want to spend 5 minutes running through 3 or 4 slides just to kind of get us oriented as to what the conversation is actually about. And so I'm hoping we can get the slides going. How do I do this? Yes, and probably, I'm going to ask you to move across briefly. So I'm really going to run through these quite quickly, but it'll sort of give you a feel. Kind of why is this important? You know, it's how biomass and specifically biodiversity is used in the global economy, including the nexus between biodiversity and technology. So this is not a sort of pure play forest economy or food economy, if you like. It's a critical asset for many low and middle income countries. And the question is, how do we get beyond it not only being destroyed, but also not being valorized in ways that supports real development in those countries? In particular, how can low and middle income countries begin to take advantage of the way in which biomass and biodiversity is used in technology-rich sectors that increase value add and the opportunity for livelihood? So how does one move up that value chain of the bioeconomy? And of course, down there, a little bit behind the white chair, it sort of says, you know, if you happen to find any investors wandering around in COP16, the only real question they want answered is, what the hell am I investing in? Yeah, you're kind of, you know, is it trees or is it the global economy? And so one way of thinking about the answer to that confused and lost person, if you happen to come across them, is to say, it's the bioeconomy, stupid. That's what you're investing in. You need to really focus on that going forward. So just to kind of repeat the point that Julie made, a huge amount of work done during the Brazilian G20 presidencies. These are some of the topics that were covered. You know, where really are G20 members? What might those high-level principles mean? And critically, what might be a financing agenda to think about how this bioeconomy is going to be paid for and developed in different countries, not just in Switzerland, but everywhere else as well, if you like. And Julie called out the 10 principles. This does not do them justice, because these are sort of the one-line headings for each of them. But I think what the success of the G20 under Brazil has delivered is a sort of coverage of what the normative framework needs to be in thinking about a bioeconomy going forward. And the reason I say that is, to put it bluntly, a bioeconomy could end up as much part of the problem as part of the solution. You know, if we have an unfettered acceleration of the use of biomass and biodiversity in a bunch of new sectors, actually it could just be another part of the extractive, inequitable economy. And so what Brazil has tried to do during its G20 presidency is begin to build a normative frame around how this bioeconomy needs to evolve internationally over the coming years. So what is it? So this is one of these sort of strange ditties. So a bunch of people think that it's just the thing on the left, which is regenerative agriculture, food systems, the forest economy, fisheries, and so on, that green part over there. And it obviously includes that. But sort of moving into the middle, it also includes technology-enhanced photosynthesis. So stuff you're growing, but then adding a technology overlay. Think biofuels, think biochemicals, all of the areas that are technology value-adding, very contentious maybe in all sorts of different ways, but that's the sort of another piece of the story. And then finally, over on the right, you've got the kind of high-tech end of welcome. You made it through. Please come and join. No, absolutely. Please come and join us here. We're just finishing the opening, and your timing is absolutely perfect. So thank you very much indeed. I'll ask you to introduce yourself in a second, if I may. So this is actually a slide taken from Ben Durham, who works for the South African government, with yourself, Ank, that he presented at a bioeconomy forum running at the moment in Nairobi, in fact. And it's just sort of saying, what are we really talking about here once you begin to unpack the bioeconomy, particularly from a global south point of view? These are some of the areas that one might think about as being really critical through a global development lens, not only through a sector development lens, if you like. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of those examples in a moment. And then finally, just sort of, where is the scope for international cooperation? There's lots of things that needs to happen at the company level. There's lots of things that needs to happen at the country level, but there's also a bunch of stuff that needs to happen at the international level. And this is just trying to illustrate some of the different areas where international cooperation is going to be important. And why am I saying that? Because the G20 platform is a complicated animal. What can one really get it to do to advance a more equitable, sustainable bioeconomy? COP30 that Brazil will lead next year, what can one really get it to do to progress on the work that they've achieved during their G20 presidency? So that question of where international cooperation sits becomes an important part of the puzzle. Back to the panel. I hope that doesn't solve every definitional problem that is sitting in your head, and I hope we won't spend too much time on definitions and language, because I think that's not a helpful use of time, but really to dig down into the experience of the four panelists that we've got. So with that in mind, I'd like to, if I may, kick off. And Braulio, I know you've just walked in, and you're probably still wondering how on earth you managed to run so fast, but I'm actually going to start with you, if I may, because it's a logical starting point given the role that Brazil has taken in advancing a high-level, principle-based approach to developing the bioeconomy through its G20 presidency. And as you know, the title of this session is Principles to Practice, and so it would be great to get a sort of first opening from you as to how you and the Brazilian government see the next stage in translating those high-level principles into actual action and development on the ground.
Thank you for the invitation. Sorry for being late. Good morning to all. So, Brazil is on the spot because we're chairing the G20 until next month. And then we will be hosting COP30 in Belém. And we are working with the Colombian government to see how best we can make a good bridge between COP16 and COP30. That's one. We are proposing here in this meeting that we create a new work program under the CBD to work on biodiversity, climate change, and desertification in a synergistic way. So it would be a first, and the idea is to invite the other conventions to participate in the elaboration and then in the implementation of this program. So this would be something that should help. In the G20, we got the bioeconomy was one of our priorities. We got the high-level principles. That's great. It was not easy, but we got them. We also put a lot of emphasis on issues on finance and on sustainability in the production sector. So we have the declaration of ministers for agriculture, fisheries, so that also helps. But the challenges are, as you know, are huge. You probably know that Brazil is suffering a lot with extreme weather events in the last few years. This year we had droughts in most of the Amazon, most of the Pantanal wetland, and huge fires. So one risk is that when you arrive in Belém for COP30, the Amazon might be burning, and Belém might be getting ashes from those fires. I don't know if that's going to help people really decide to start moving or, but that's the reality, because we're clear. These droughts in Brazil and the big floods in the south are caused mainly by global warming. That's very clear now. So it will continue, right? So that's the risk. We are putting a lot of emphasis on establishing a very ambitious public policy on to promote bioeconomy in Brazil. It will not be easy because we don't want just to continue what we see in places like the Amazon, which is very basic extractivism and selling of raw materials. That's not going to change the situation. We need to add value with science and technology, right? And then we should be able then to pay back to the local communities to get opportunities for jobs and better earnings, etc., out of this, right? But then we have to face a big challenges, logistics. Right now, because of the droughts, those huge rivers in the Amazon, like the Amazon, the Madeira, the Negro, they have not much more than 1 palm of depth. Imagine that. These are the largest rivers in the world. And most of communication and commerce in the Amazon is done through the ships and boats by the river. So the issue of logistics will be one that we will have to find solutions. We need to enhance also capacity building for local producers. We need to facilitate access to funding. So most small enterprises have lots of difficulties to get access to funding. There are many sources of funding in Brazil, but they have lots of requirements. And these small enterprises don't have the capacity to meet those requirements. So they're out of the market in a way. So these are a lot major challenges. One good news you probably heard in Dubai from our Minister of Finance, Fernando Haddad. He is putting together a green transition for the Brazilian economy. And he hopes to finalize this whole plan and put it into implementation by next year. So there are several priorities there. One is decarbonizing the Brazilian economy. The other is scaling up bioeconomy. The other is increasing our capacity for adaptation to climate change. Another one is increasing investments in science and technology. For example, the Brazilian Amazon, which represents almost half of the country, receives only 3% of all the science and technology investments from the Brazilian government. We're not going to change anything like if we continue like that. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, you're absolutely not. I still have this image of Belém on fire, but that sense of urgency comes through, and that sort of contradiction of both the importance of using biomass and biodiversity in a sustainable way and the fragility of that natural capital, it really plays through. Anke, I'm going to come on to you, if I may. Officially, South Africa hasn't announced its G20 program yet, so you're running ahead of the official news. But our understanding is that it is likely to take forward the bioeconomy under its presidency, obviously with a G20-wide mandate, but with a particular interest on developments on the continent. And it would be great to hear from you again, kind of how South Africa sees taking the work that the Brazilian G20 presidency has moved forward this year into its own leadership period next year.
Thanks, Simon, and greetings, everyone. Before my input, I would like to also acknowledge Colombia for inviting us to come and share what it is that we're doing, not only in South Africa, but also in Africa. And coming from the sector that deals with indigenous knowledge systems, I also would like to acknowledge the indigenous wisdom keepers of this land and this continent as well. Yes, indeed, South Africa it's very excited to really take the agenda forward, the bioeconomy agenda forward as of next year. The approach that South Africa will be taking is not different from what was agreed in Brazil. I think the idea is to create a situation where there is continuity of this agenda beyond Brazil and South Africa. Of course, high on the agenda from not only, I won't say it's a South African position, but it's more of a pan-African position that human health is very critical, as you pointed out on the slides. But it should be linked to nature, to the planet. There is no way in which we can talk about bioeconomy without talking to land and nature. Food, the concept of food has to change as well. I guess if you look into the entire world, South Africa has got the highest number of people who are starving, yet we are amongst one of the most biodiverse, continents in the world. If I link to principle and practice, what I shared with you outside was that there has to be certain principles which are grounded in the core of indigenous knowledge systems for the idea not to float around and not be grounded. Therefore, the concept of inclusivity has to be revisited. And in South Africa, we talk about the concept of Ubuntu. In this case, we will be introducing what we call Ubuntu-based bioinnovation, meaning that the wisdom keepers will be the ones that ground this concept of bioeconomy. But there has to be strong innovation, as our colleague from Brazil said, strong science, technology, and innovation to look into biodiversity using these timeless wisdoms and then moving then towards high technology for the benefit of the whole, for the second benefit of the whole. Finally, we are saying as South Africa that it's important for us to look into the full value chain, but the wisdom keepers are saying it shouldn't be only technological value chains, but also process chains, meaning that there has to be inclusion from agenda setting to research and development, to the types of innovations that we come up with, to technology transfer, entrepreneurship, and conscious commercialization that takes care of the sustainability of the planet. That's how South Africa is looking into bioeconomy moving forward.
Brilliant. And it's a fantastic segue to Diane. So, how does one bridge that vision of an Ubuntu-based bioeconomy with the realities of a global economy and the way in which corporations function? Diane, you're in the leadership team of probably the world's most important, one of the largest sort of corporate business communities focused on sustainability. And I'd love you to sort of describe both what you're doing, but sort of help to make a link back to Ank's comments, which are kind of grounding the principles in a particular way.
Yeah, Simon, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Just briefly, for those who don't know WBCSD, it is a community of over 250 leading, mostly global businesses across all sectors who have pretty strict membership criteria on how they're demonstrating progress. And this multi-sector element is really important because each of these companies has global supply chains, global value chains. That means that they're looking at the bioeconomy in three important ways. One is and you raised it actually, Braulio, this concept of physical risk in their operations and their supply chains is very, very real. So it takes this concept of climate and nature intersections and makes it very real to the business strategic planning and operational planning for execution. So we're working in that space. The second piece is it addresses, as you showed, Simon, how business supply chains need to become way more transparent and traceable, particularly for all of their bio-based materials across ag and food, construction, biofuels, et cetera. And that's something that has so many layers in it right now that it's causing huge challenges. There are some sectors that are moving faster on that than others, but it's going to require a lot of innovation and technology and is going to really change the finance aspects of the bioeconomy from the provisioning of land-based materials. But the third piece is in this area of innovation when it comes to decarbonization. Because one of the big drivers of the bioeconomy is going to be companies trying to understand how to move from petroleum, fossil-based inputs and materials to bio-based materials. And I don't think that we are ready at a government level or at a business level for the explosion in demand that is starting to shift us towards. And so I'd love to give great appreciation first to Brazil for creating an aligned definition around the bioeconomy, with great thanks for the bridge building that goes into South Africa, who will pick that up and continue to carry it forward in a consistent way at the G20. Because from a business perspective, to be able to be responsive and consistent and credible, that level of government coherence is super important. So how that carries through into policy is going to be critical. But then it also comes into how does business then on its own take it forward? And just two quick examples, Simon. One is Brazil, and again, just a quick shout out of thanks to be bridge building between the biodiversity COP this year in Colombia into Belém next year in the climate COP. That's also unprecedented, but is really important at how we think about this level of coherent investment for these solutions. But on November 7th, WBCSD is hosting, in partnership with the government of Brazil and São Paulo, a financing roundtable for deforestation-free soy. That is an issue in the Cerrado that has been really positively addressed in many ways by the governments and many businesses. But there's a lot more work to do, especially when it comes to farmer-level investment, like you were saying, Braulio. And this is going to be a roundtable of looking at the stacked investment requirements to actually drive transition plans that work for the Cerrado region, for the farmers in that region, and for the businesses that are investing and whose supply chains depend on it. So that multi-stakeholder engagement is one example. A second one is much higher level, and that is how do we drive business guidance to be nature positive from a bioeconomy standpoint in sectors that are really dependent. And this week we're just announcing, for example, one of the next sectors of nature positive roadmap guidance for pharmaceuticals that are surprisingly dependent on bioeconomy innovation and technology for how they continue to develop and sell their products. So just two examples that show how connected this agenda needs to be.
Diane, brilliant. And that pharmaceuticals piece obviously cuts across into a theme of considerable interest in COP16, which is the negotiations around the DSI. We won't dive into that right now, as I think we'd spend most of our time on it. But these critical connections, require dialogue and engagement, but there are also real tensions and trade-offs, in how that value chain is really going to be shared as well as developed. Amadou, you've been very patient. I like to think that the financial sector is in the service of the vision of a sustainable economy. And we've heard parts of how that might happen. Now, obviously, you're part of a particular part of the financial sector, which is the African Development Bank. It would be lovely to hear from you kind of how you and the AFDB see ways in which that financing requirement in this transformative vision can be turned into practice.
Thank you very much, and very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Again, my name is Bamba Diop, and I'm from the African Development Bank, and based in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. I was telling it at the table that English is not my main working language, but I love to do sometimes semantics, just to analyze a little bit the words. And when I got the invitation, the three words that I saw, principle, policies, and practice, I was just trying to play a little bit around. And I was saying to myself, maybe the principle is more allied or close to the kind of visions that we have in a broad way, that we need to narrow down to policies. And now the policies that we have need to be put in practice to be implemented. And I'm on that level. What I am doing is I'm developing a project, conservation project on the ground, working with the communities, working with the various stakeholders. Logic wants that we learn lessons from the practice and trying to translate it to policies, but it doesn't work most of the time like that. Yesterday, I was in a panel with the UN trade, UN tagged, I think, and we were talking about trade of wildlife. And I was giving them one example that I had, because if you remember, it was like 7 or 8 years ago, less than 10 years ago, there was a huge massacre of elephants in northern Cameroon, Chad, Central African Republic. And the bank intervened, and I had my team, and we were working in the project, and we were working with the WWF. But our main constraint was trade. We did all the technical, financial, procurement stuff that we did in our project, but at the end, it didn't provide us the results of what we wanted because of policy trade. When we're talking about elephants, we're talking about ivory. Who consuming ivory? It's not Africa, it's not Latin America, it's Asia. So unless you have, something to do with international trade, with policies that are related to trade, whatever you do to save biodiversity, elephants, rhinoceros, going to be very difficult in Africa. So we call that kind of policy failures on our side. On their side, it is not. But just to show that the linkage there is a little bit difficult to do. We also need to understand, we're talking about MDBs, multilateral development banks. To understand how they work, we have policies in every single sector, and we need to inspire what we're doing to those policies. When you see a project paper from ADB or World Bank or whatever institution, most of the time they have a chapter that they call project alignment, and in which you have to demonstrate how your project is responding to these major policies. And sometimes those work are done by economists. I don't know if you have economists around that do not understand what's going on. But the alignment has to be proved in your project. So you respect that. But something that is important, and I want to point out, is also you have this umbrella, you have this policy to refer yourself. There's another thing that we call the country strategies. These institutions are owned by governments. There are governments who sit on the board to approve the project. And what we do is a dialogue with the country every 3 years, every 5 years, it depends on the institution. And when you do the dialogue, you identify what we call the pillars. So pillars can be education, transport, etc. But if you look at these country strategies papers or policies of those countries, mostly for Africa or developing country, it's rare to see environment as a pillar. Environment is most of the time pushed as, for grant money, for philanthropic money, etc. So and today, there's a need, there's a need to demonstrate that it is a business at this time that I'm talking to you, I'm working a lot in ecotourism. The potential of ecotourism of Africa is huge. I've been 2 times in Madagascar. I'm a conservation biologist by training. I have seen it all around Africa, but what I have seen in that country is amazing. The potential is there, but the pillar is not environment. The pillar is not green growth. So just to put this, that the understanding, the education that we need to put at policymakers to understand, and even the ways that we talk, the ways that we communicate also, we have to check it. But my summary is just the potential is there in matter of policies, but also a lot of work needs to be done to convince other partners. Thank you.
So that's great. And it's really interesting because when the G20 initiative on the bioeconomy discussed financing in Rio a month or so ago, one of the things that came through really strongly was one can't think of financing and financing instruments independently of industrial and economic strategies, such as the example you gave, Braulio, and independently of the broader policy environment. One needs to understand financing in that broader context, and I think that comes through really clearly from the examples you're giving. Braulio, I know having fought your way in at 10 o'clock, you're going to fight your way out because you need to get to the negotiation rooms, and so I'm going to come back to you if I may, but ask you...
Sure, no, I still have some minutes.
You've still got some minutes. Okay, so I'm going to go into the second round, and I'm going to ask the panel maybe just to give 2-minute answers to the questions so that we can then turn to the audience for a little bit as well. Braulio, I wanted to kind of pivot you to COP30 in particular. You know, the message we've all understood is nature is climate, climate is nature, you know, all of these things are intimately interconnected. Taking the bioeconomy theme into COP30, what concretely do you think one could do in that space and could be useful both for the climate agenda and for the bioeconomy development agenda?
I'm not sure, Simon. What I'm sure is that the Brazilian government will provide more time for issues related to biodiversity at COP30. So that will happen. And so it's still time for us to think how best to utilize that space and make connections with the climate discussion in Belém. As I mentioned, we will be pushing for synergy among the 3 Rio conventions. So that will come up at COP30. So our National Secretary for Climate Change, Ana Toni, she's pushing for this. So she wants to see a decision at COP30 on the synergy among the 3 Rio conventions. So that's one thing we can make use. Of course, the whole issue of financing. So financing is a much bigger agenda in the climate discussions than in biodiversity. So we could benefit from that and seek opportunities that all we're discussing on biodiversity, on bioeconomy, can benefit also from all these different progress that we're having with climate funding. Of course, climate funding also has its own problems, we know. But I think if we can join forces, maybe things can work. In terms of just related to what we can do, I think one thing is really the finance sector. In Brazil, I have been engaged in several discussions. As I mentioned in the example, many people, many small enterprises have difficulties to have access to funding. So in Brazil, there's a lot of opportunities for funding for development, but most banks have large requirements to be fulfilled. And the small enterprises usually cannot fulfill these requirements. One thing that is working is incentivizing partnership between cooperatives and association of small enterprises with the third sector, with NGOs and others that have the necessary qualification to help these enterprises to meet their requirements and get access to funding. So that's one thing. Another, I think, would be to put pressure on the finance sector to establish internal requirements for their managers. So in Brazil, for example, we have a special constitutional fund for the Amazon, which is managed by the Bank of the Amazon. Then you look their portfolio. What are they financing in the Amazon? Soya and cattle. Come on. Why? Because it's much easier for the bank managers because they know how to make risk assessment and predict economic return. They were not trained. They don't know how to do that for innovative projects. So we need to train them, and we need to create rewards inside the banks to reward those managers that increase their portfolios of loans with sustainable projects. So far, the incentive they receive is just to increase their portfolio, no matter what, with no special attention to sustainability.
That's really brilliant. Thank you. And it so echoes some of the conversations that happened around the G20 meeting in Rio. It's hard to imagine that large financial institutions just don't have the capabilities. It isn't just that they're fixated on particular kinds of investments, but they don't really have the skills often to bridge traditional banking knowledge with changes in the underlying investment landscape that need to be really embraced. So I think that point is very well taken.
One good thing is some of the action of central banks. The Brazilian Central Bank is very active. For the last 3-4 years, they have been issuing annual reports to all the financial sector in Brazil in increasing their requirements for reduction of social, environmental, and climate risk of all their operations. They have been establishing new regulations, and they're establishing indicators to monitor the finance sector.
Brilliant. I'm going to come on to the rest of the panel. I'm going to ask you to contain your enthusiasm to a couple of minutes. Obviously, you've got a particular way of thinking about the bioeconomy as well as being in the government that will take it forward for the G20. I'm going to be slightly cheeky and ask, with Diane here, sort of not representing the corporate community, but reflecting some of their capabilities and visions, what do you want from the corporate sector? Kind of what do they need to do now to fit into the vision that you gave a few minutes ago?
Yeah, it's a very pertinent question. It's a very essential question. I would respond to this using some of the examples, maybe 1 or 2 examples of what we have done at home, and we think it's something that can work. I shared with you that our Ubuntu-based bioeconomy model has got the aspect of inclusive innovation, which is linked to technology transfer and enterprise development. It is here at the enterprise development stage that small, medium enterprises, for example, require support. As Borilio was saying, that it's most of the banks or finances, they just don't know how to work with the so-called informal sector. But what we have done in South Africa is that we developed a model where we brought in for example, the Industrial Development Corporation and some of the small, medium enterprise agencies to pilot how to finance a group of women, not through another agency, but directly giving them funding and really train them, hold their hand and accelerate them in order to turn them into proper businessmen and women. I think it's a good model where business will have to start trusting that people have knowledge a good example is if you just go outside, you'll see that a lot of women, youth, they are selling things and they are thriving. It is the case in Africa. So what I will say to the development agencies and the banks is to start looking into new funding models, new finance models, and really take risk if we are to make bioeconomy work. Otherwise, we will go back to the same model, which won't really lead us anywhere.
Thank you. And Diane, I'm kind of going to ask you the same question. You know, South Africa is going to convene governments from around the world to try and advance the policy frameworks that shape the bioeconomy going forward. You know, from the corporate community, what do you really need them to deliver?
The opportunity to create a consistent policy framework that supports those 10 objectives for a bioeconomy and links them together across ministries gives that credibility and consistency for investment and business action, because businesses need to change how they think about this quite substantially as well. Like you were just saying, the ability for businesses to engage all the way to the ground with stakeholders for decision making is not common practice for most businesses. So helping build capacity, help building those connections through policies that are enabling that are very important. There's trade elements that you spoke to as well that are going to be key for moving this forward. But there's also this aspect of incentivizing the business investment that will need to take place, because those supply chains that have been locked in now for several decades also need to change radically. And that's going to require a level of cooperative investment that can be anticipated in the bioeconomy policy frameworks.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm going to come to you briefly before I turn to the audience for a few questions and comments. So the AFDB is a really important MDB on the African continent, but also South Africa will be hosting the Financing Common at the end of February, which brings together the 600 public development banks around the world and into the context of their G20 presidency, co-hosted by the Development Bank of South Africa and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I guess I'd love to get your take on what can we really expect from that MDB community as a whole in supporting the financing needs and the policy development needs, as you said, of this bioeconomy as it evolves?
Thank you for the question. Financing is very important. Since I have been here last Saturday to now, every single day I have at least a couple panel of presentation and talking about financing. It is there, like we say in French, c'est le nerf de la guerre. It means that that's the key drivers that you need in order to implement whatever you want to do. But jumping a little bit on your questions, I'm sure people are working a lot to gather money, to create some kind of facilities, new mechanism, and to make sure those who are in charge or who are living with the biological resources can get to the resources. All this is being done. But I want to just share something. Yesterday, I have been invited as a panelist by the youth, young people. And it was a late session, a little bit tired, but I had to go. And I went there, and they were presenting me projects that they had, and they even make a ranking with a winner, etc. And most of the projects were preservation projects, restoration, etc. And I wanted to teach them a little bit. I told them, I'm not very, how to put it, it was in French, very happy about what I have seen. Because with young people right now, what I want is them to be entrepreneurs. I want you guys to present me more enterprises, conservation enterprises project than preservation, restoration. Our generation, 40 to up, we have been doing it. We get a lot of money. Of course, success stories have, but we recognize that things didn't work the way we wanted. So with MDBs that have the financing, I think that they should open up. They should get away a little bit the classic way. And the private sector, with young people at a local level, I think it's a key now. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I want to turn to the audience to take maybe a cluster of 3 or 4 comments or questions, and then I'll come back to the panel. Do we have a mic, or am I using my mic? We're using that mic. Okay, so maybe we'll start here, and then there are a couple over on the left, and then, oh, dodgy, very dodgy over here on the right.
Hello, my name is Joanna. I'm actually French-Brazilian living in Cape Town, so this was very useful for me. I'm building investment vehicles for conservation specifically in Brazil and in Africa. And one of our business model for investors is that we are betting on returns by buying surface rights from NGOs that own land for any ecosystem services, any nature credits, basically anything that is recognized as a nature value that doesn't do any extractivism. So, forestry wouldn't work. One of the key things they keep telling me, the corporates, when I try to, find a buyer to show that we'll have annual revenue, is that they can't put a price on things. It's very hard to, the whole price is what you pay, value is what you get. We know the value we're getting, but we don't have mechanisms to price things. And so you guys talk about policies, but my question is, what about incentives or subsidies that can help put a price for corporates? That could say, for example, there's a tax rebate if you are if you're trying to be nature positive, if you are measuring, and then somebody here mentioned about, I think it was Braulio that mentioned, or maybe it was you, about indicators, having indicators, and it's like if you could define as indicators and attach something.
So incentives, definitely. Got it. Okay, just hold that thought. I'm going to collect another couple if I may. I'm going to take those 2 at the back, and then this gentleman over here on the right.
Thank you. I'm Vasilis from WWF UK. I have a question for you, Dr. Chabalala. It's very exciting that the South African government is picking up. Of course, it's very exciting that the South African government is picking up the bioeconomy agenda and they will build on it. I was wondering if the excitement for the bioeconomy